lovely Sunday morning. Welcome. I hope you've had a good week. And thank you for being with us today.
Yeah.
Whenever you're watching, evening, afternoon.
It's weekend.
It is weekend again. And yeah, it's been a busy one. With the kids, there's always sport and
Now we got 2 kids for sports. We used
Yeah.
to just have the one.
Yep, now we have two and a dancer.
Yeah.
Anyway, we're going to jump straight into what we're doing. Running.
Yeah.
All right, a little bit of interruption here. We're busy looking at the first 3 chapters of Genesis to see whether there are 2 different creation stories in there. Now, if you've been reading the Bible all your life, you've probably never even thought about this because we believe that Moses wrote the whole Old Testament, or excuse me, the Torah, and specifically Genesis. And so why would anyone write 2 creation stories, put them right next to each other if you have one person writing it? The reality, however, is, and that's what we had a look at last week, is that it doesn't seem like the Torah was written by Moses at all. It's most probable that he didn't write the Torah, but that it is the result of a complex literary process of plenty of sources coming together and being redacted or put together by a final redactor in and around the time of the exile, more or less, right? So that's the 6th century. So we had to look at some of the reasons why scholars don't believe that Moses wrote it, some of the evidences that there is within the Torah, for instance, why they believe that it was the result of a complex process. And one of those reasons was the presence of duplets or triplets, right? So we had a look at a couple of things that appear to be in the Torah twice, and how they are sometimes things like the 10 Commandments are not the same, and you would think that they would be.
Yeah.
And so scholars explain that by saying that these are actually 2 traditions that results in 2 sources that eventually was brought together and put in, and that the ancient redactors, the most important thing for them is to preserve the traditions, not just to try and figure out which one is right. And that's why we have often things in doublets, like the life of David twice, the genealogy of Adam twice, 2 accounts of the flood and Noah interweaved with one another. That brings us to the topic of this little mini series: is there a chance that we actually have 2 creation stories that come from 2 different traditions, possibly written at 2 different times by 2 different people, but that were included both together, nicely packaged for us, or packaged for the ancient Israelites, give them a sense of how things began. Remembering that at that time there would have been in the people that were dominating them, the Assyrians, later the Persians, and the Babylonians, they all had their own creation myths in which they explained and understood how the world came to be. So the Jews kind of needed something like that as well, and they wrote something like that, and that is what we have in our Bibles: an explanation of how God created things, and also a direct connection with Adam. And so it seems like part of the reason for the first couple of chapters in Genesis is to tie the people of Israel directly back to Adam, which it seems like they understood him to be the first man that ever lived. Okay, so we had a look at some of quite a neat structure that we find within the book of Genesis particularly, and that is this kind of like a heading or a little phrase that gets put in about 10 times within the book of Genesis. And it goes something like this. It says, these are the generations of, and then it starts off with, well, I'm working backwards. It's Israel, Esau, Ishmael, Isaac, Terah, Shem, sons of Noah, Noah, Adam, and then there's one more, and that's the one that's interesting to us because they seem to place this little, I'm just going to call it a heading from now on, they placed it in between the 2 supposed 2 creation stories, and it would have made sense to put it at the beginning. And even still, if you go read it now, you'll see like it should be at the very beginning of the book of Genesis, but it's not. It's in the middle between these 2 stories. I've always believed that the second story, the one that starts in chapter 2, verse 4, and runs towards, let's say, the end of chapter 3, is a further explanation of the first one we find in Genesis 1, like an unfolding of it. And I think to some degree it makes sense to me that the final redactors, that was their purpose, to frame it as such. But once you become aware of the fact or the possibility that we might be dealing with different traditions, you for the first time go back and you go read those two stories and say, if they are two stories, there'll be things in them which can't be reconciled. If they are not two stories and they are the unfolding of the first story, then this should all make perfect sense. God should be, for instance, be portrayed in the same way. The order of creation should more or less be the same. The same name should be used for God. There shouldn't be contradictory ideas in there. And so that's what we're doing in these sessions. And today we're going to be starting with the second story, the second supposed story, which starts with our little heading in chapter 2, verse 4. And then I'm just going to follow the Genesis here. I don't think I'm going to be running through my notes because it's quite self-explanatory as we run through it. But we do see that. So we're going to now be dealing with the supposed second story, starting in Genesis 2, verse 4, and running all the way through to the end of chapter 3. That's where we'll limit ourselves. But that portion seems to have two sections within it. The first one is like a creation account. That is from verse 4 of chapter 2 up until verse 25. And then we have what I like to call the exile. And this is the account in which Adam and Eve is thrown out of the garden. Now, most people call this the fall, but Genesis doesn't call it a fall. There's no such word in Genesis as a fall. It is a later interpretation, a later Christian interpretation back on the text. One thing that I think we're going to be talking about a lot is the ability to read, or the endeavor to read the Bible, here Genesis, for what it actually says, and to try and divorce yourself from your own tradition, your own denomination, what they told you everything means. Because a lot of that is basically just, it's an interpretation in light of later things, which the people who read this for the first time, they would not have had that information. And so we want to try and get back to, it's impossible, but we want to try and get back to what the writer would have intended, and what, especially for his contemporary audience.
We've only ever read the creation account within the context of tradition, and that we only been taught it
absolutely
in a traditional sense.
Because our tradition told us that Moses wrote it. So it has to all be perfectly making sense with each other. It has to harmonize with each other and with every single word from there on until the book of Revelation. Once you become aware that there is a possibility that this is in fact not how the Bible is written, and that it's multiple authors who actually sometimes have their own voice, and sometimes they have ideas that are in tension with one another, and that's maybe to some degree the purpose of the Bible, is to highlight those tensions and the wrestling that people have had with the existence of God and getting to know God, etc., etc. Okay, so one of the phrases I'll use often is, let's read it for what it says, and you'll see very quickly, Tori, and you're going to be a guinea pig here. It's too easy to place these words into an already formed context within your own mind. So we're going to try and create a new, fresh look at this Genesis 2, verse 4, up until the end of chapter 3. Okay, so if you're ready for that, this is not an easy process. It was extremely hard for me to do it in the beginning because my context and my tradition just constantly wants to overwhelm everything.
Overtake it, yeah.
All right, so we're going to then start with chapter 2, verse 4. Why not with verse 1? Well, verse 1 to 3 seems to be still part of the previous chapter 1, and we have this heading inserted. Remember, initially there was no chapters. So we came and said, oh, chapter 2 starts here. But if we look at the actual structure of Genesis, there is a break where the heading sits. And this is how it goes, chapter 2, verse 4. These are the generations, they're familiar, but this time not of a person, of the heavens and of the earth, when they were created in the day that the Lord God had made the heavens and the earth. So what you can expect, if the writer of Genesis, the redactors, are consistent, is you would now expect an account of heaven and earth and how God put these things together. Like after these are the generations of Adam or the generations of Enoch, you expect an account of maybe a genealogy or maybe the life story of someone. Okay, so you can see how this very well fits with the beginning of something. And then this amazing story unfolds. And now, the real challenge here is in our mind to forget about chapter 1 and put it aside and to create a brand new picture of this chapter and where it's going to lead us at the moment. So we're gonna have to take our time to do this properly. Okay. The first thing I'd like you to know, just as in this heading, is it says, "In the day that the Lord God." The Lord God here is Yahweh Elohim. Okay, so Yahweh is like the personal name of God. We don't know how it's supposed to be pronounced, but it's Yod Hey Vav Hey, the tetragrammaton, 4 letters, Hebrew letters. But then it's added to that is Elohim. Elohim is an ancient way to refer to God. It's a plural name. Often it's used singular, but it can also be used plural. One thing that we do need to note that in the old Canaanitic pantheon, they were called, the Elohim was the council of gods, like a number of gods, or possibly the family of gods, sometimes even the sons of God. So it has this element of strength and deity and possibly plurality that sits with it. And why I'm making a scene about this is it is important to have a look at the name that is used for God, because it's consistently used for God in the second session. Is always called Yahweh Elohim. Okay. All right, so we make that point. Okay, so let's start. We're starting fresh, right? Is your mind blank, Tori?
I'm trying my best.
Are you blank? "And every plant of the field before it was in the earth, and every herb of the field before it grew, for the Lord had not caused it to rain upon the earth, and there was no man to till the ground." Okay, this is the King James. You have to forgive them a little bit. Sometimes the logic sits backwards. But the point of verse 5 is that there are no plants of the field in the earth, and there are no herbs of the field in the earth, because there's no rain on the earth, and there's no man to work the field. All right, so let's just start by saying, what do we actually have? We have no man, and we have no plants, but we do have an earth. All right, so that's important. So we have an earth. All right. Do we have a sky? I think it would be safe to assume that we do have a sky if you read the rest of this chapter. But what does the earth look like? Well, there are no plants, right? As you read further, you'll understand there are no animals. There are no birds. There are no fish. There are also no humans. There's actually nothing living on this earth. What would it look like if you closed your eyes? Well, for all intents and purposes, I believe that they would have assumed this to be flat, right?
Yeah.
But whether it's flat or round, when you look at the earth around you, it looks flat. So we're just going to see in our mind's eye a very flat piece of earth with no rain. All right. So this is written in Mesopotamia, and so a lot of it is Arab land. And if there would be no plants, it's just basic. What do you then have? You have ground, and you have dust. So if you can see in your mind's eye, that's all you have. The writer doesn't tell us, and God formed the earth and he rolled a little ball. We got nothing of that. It starts with an earth already in place, which means the technical term for that is it's not ex nihilo, which means it's not. This creation account is not from nothing. Things are already there. There's just no life. Right? So we already have an earth. So this is more a formation or an ordering of things and the bringing about of life. The earth is there, possibly sky. The account tells us nothing about sun, moon, and stars. We've got nothing from that. Okay. So we got nothing. Man isn't there. There's two reasons given for why there's no plants and no, plants and no herbs. Number one, there's no rain. And number two, there's no man to make these things grow and to make them multiply. All right. So here already you have an understanding of one of the purposes that we'll pick up here of man. Man's job here is to make the plants grow, to make the herbs grow, to make them multiply. All right. Okay. But there was a mist, like a fog, that came up from the earth. So can you see now? It can make like a wilderness type of place. There's no water anywhere. There's no rain. But there is a fog that's hanging above. And that fog is like a moisture that now turns dust. If I took dust and I add moisture, by rain, but by fog or mist, I'm starting to have a substance in my hand. And what would you call that substance, Tori?
Like a mud.
Like a mud. Good one. All right. And this mist was hanging is that it moistened the face of the ground. Now, this word ground here is the word Adamah, right? So the ground is called Adamah. Now, of course, that's a familiar term to you because of the name Adam. But actually, the term Adam in Genesis here is not a name for a person. It actually means human. So the human is the one that comes from the ground one, the one that's formed from the ground. We understand that. Okay. So verse 7. And the Lord God, always Lord God here, Yahweh Elohim, he formed man. So the word formed here is to literally, you can see a potter sitting with clay. You know, like when we were kids, if you ever played in mud and you made little homes and you take the clay and you form it and you mold it the way you want to have it, or you can think of a potter that sits and makes a pot. But the point is, it's very hands-on. God doesn't say or speak the man into being. He forms him. It's like he's sitting there with the clay and he rolls it up and he makes the arms. And I'm exaggerating a bit, but I think it's very apt to understand here. God is not speaking anything into being. He's actually making the stuff, right? So he forms man, Adamah. Now, the question that you should ask is this man and woman? Is this just male? Is this male and female? We're not told at this point, it's not, it doesn't say male. That word man is not male, it's human. He makes the male, he makes the human from the dust of the ground. So now he's now busy forming this thing. He makes it, and then he takes it by the nostrils and he breathes his breath into the nostrils of the man. And when he breathes into the nostrils of the man becomes a living being. Now, our Bibles say living soul, but soul is a terrible translation here because it really doesn't mean soul. It means a living, something that is alive or a breathing creature. And so here you have the first thing that God does is he takes clay and he makes this man. He breathes into his nostrils. Now, many of you are gonna, at this point, you have the first chapter in your mind of a God that sits far and speaks everything into being. But this is not what we have here. He's forming things. He's breathing into things. It's a little bit different, right? He formed man from the dust of the ground. He breathed into his nostrils, and man became a living being, a breathing Adamah, a breathing dust in that sense. So what happens next? Well, then Yahweh Elohim, he plants a garden eastward in India, in Eden. Okay, so all right. So we now have a man, but there's still just moist clay everywhere. Now we have a garden that's eastward in India. East is that in Eden, excuse me. East is that way, Tori. And in the old Hebrew, east means in front. Like that was always the front. Everything was facing east, right? So the word east in Hebrew actually means in the front, but we also know it means in the east. So you have Eden, and in or in front of Eden, you have a new garden that God goes and he plants the garden, which is really important again because God doesn't speak the garden into being. He goes and he plants it. These are practical, hands-on verbs for how he does this, right? He plants the garden eastward in Eden, and then he takes the man and he puts him there, right? So now the man is standing in the garden. He's a living being. There's a space here that needs to be cultivated, right? Out of the ground now, the same ground, God makes to grow every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food, including the tree of life, which is in the middle of the garden, and also then the tree of knowledge, which is in the middle of the garden. Okay, so have you still got the picture? You've got a moist clay expanse, and you have this garden now that has trees. Excuse me. Here is an anomaly in this vast expanse, a small piece of land where the human is standing, right, for now. He's breathing, he's alive, and suddenly there are these trees. God actually plants the trees. Like so, God's not only an artist that creates a beautiful body and breathes, and he's also a gardener. He's also a husbandman, as the old King James. He puts a garden together for the man. Now the man stands. Yeah, he's there, right? And And then it tells us that there is a river that comes from Eden and it goes through this garden and it waters this garden. Still, we don't really have any rain. We just have the fog and this river, right? And then after the garden, it splits into four. And then it goes to areas, and I'm not going to read all of this, but as the account explains to us, this river runs into areas we know: Ethiopia, Mesopotamia. Some of these rivers we know the names of: Euphrates, and so on. And so this gives us it gives the reader a real terrestrial placement, or a locator for, hey, we know that river. It's here somewhere. This place was, right. So we're not talking about anywhere on the planet. We're talking. He's locating this for the reader in their own context. Okay. I'm not going to read all of it. It speaks about gold and onyx and so on and so on. Let's go to verse 50. And then the Lord God took the man and he put him in the garden. So it seems like a repetition of what was said earlier. Sometimes that's fine. So he takes the man and he puts him. Right? You got to get this, that God doesn't say, man, go there. He doesn't intuitively, he takes the man and he puts him. He forms him, he takes him, he puts him, he breathes. He plants gardens.
Yeah.
What's busy forming here, as you'll see by the end of the whole exercise, what we call a very anthropomorphical view of God. That means God is very human-like here. The writer here thinks of himself when he plants, when he makes, when he forms, when he molds, when he takes and he puts and he breathes. I think most of us will agree that God doesn't really have actual breath. But it's very important to understand that the writer is putting it in terms of the things he understands. When he wakes up in the morning, this writer that's possibly, let's say, from the 7th, 8th, or the 6th century, he gets up in the morning. He molds little things, pottery. He plants gardens. He waters them. He takes things and places them. He leads his children into places. He's writing it in terms of a very human form. And this is a very ancient way in which humans, ancients, thought of the gods. They thought of the gods to be very anthropomorphic, meaning basically humans with superpowers, but they could come. Like, for instance, me and my daughter, we watched the Homeric epics of Iliad and Odyssey, which is some of the oldest literature in the Western canon. And in there, the gods are, Odysseus is the hero and he goes around doing all these things, and I don't want to get into that. But the gods come and give him plants to eat. The gods, they have sex with him. They with him. They walk with him. They talk with him. They sit next to him. The gods for those people are basically, the best way to say it, humans with superpowers that appears from time to time. And it does seem like this account is very anthropomorphic. It is like this God in this section here, what is called Yahweh Elohim. He plants, he breathes, he molds, he forms, very much like that. And this whole story, every second verse is God doing a human-like action. Okay. So God took him, he put him in the garden, and then he tells him, it doesn't tell him, but it says to dress it and keep it. So in this whole chapter, in this whole story, the purpose of man is a simple one: to look after the garden. There's no other purpose given to man here. And it says to work the garden, and to dress the garden. And that word means to work, or to even possibly notions of to slave in the garden. That's your job. You got to look after the garden. Now, interestingly enough, once again, back to the very ancient view of the gods. In some of the other Mesopotamian creation myths, the humans are made for exactly that reason. They got to make food. They got to plant. They got to breed so that they can feed the gods. So when they bring sacrifices, right? Remember, this is a human perspective. Their sacrifices was quite literally in the very old time to come and feed the gods. They would even put the stuff in the statues' mouths. They're feeding those gods, and then the gods in return would give them good harvest, keep them safe, give them rain when they need it, keep the thunder away. So there's just a very strong notion here that this human is made to work the field. That's your job. Now, you can, in your head, you can start contrasting that with the first Genesis story, but I'm not going to be doing that now. I'm just pointing out that some of the ancient Mesopotamian myths that a little bit older than the biblical accounts, Humans are made, that's their job. They got to grow stuff and tend to the plants and so on. Okay. So to dress it and keep it. And the Lord God commanded the man. Now God is talking, right? Okay, so this is all right. God is now talking. Now, I've been a Christian for a long time. God doesn't talk. The God I believe in I don't hear him audibly. He doesn't like me and you talk. It's a different type of talk that we're talking about when we say God said to me or God spoke. But here not. Here it's hello, hey.
Yeah, didn't say the man felt in his heart to do this.
No, not felt in his heart. No, it's a different scenario, but it's a very anthropomorphic type of thing. Okay, so God commands him saying, you can eat of every tree of the garden, you can freely eat of all of it, right? But the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you won't eat of that one, because in the day that you eat from this, you will surely die. So there's this tree. We need to talk about this. We need to talk about why God in the first place makes this tree. And why does he put it in the middle of the garden and then puts a warning out? Like that's how you get someone to eat of something. You know what I mean? You put it there and you say, don't touch. Like if you buy chocolates and you put it in the cupboard and you come past me and say, this honey, there's chocolate in the cupboard, please don't eat it. Like, you know what's going to happen. So what would you rather do? Don't buy the chocolates or hide it. It's not what's going on here. So there's a feeling of a bit of a inevitability about these guys, getting into the chocolates, I guess. Then there's this next little thing here, which is really curious. Yahweh Elohim says, it's not good that man should be alone, right? I'm going to form and mold for him a helper, right? So it doesn't say here that, let me just stick to that. It just says that. It says, hey, this is not good. This is weird here, okay? Because he makes this whole scenario with human that can tend the plants, and then he says, this is not good. You can't be alone like this. Okay? What's wrong with it? Well, he needs a helper, right? So helper here, I don't think it's someone that can carry the wood and get the water. I think it might have even some sexual implication, possibly like someone that is his mate, his friend. So God has a plan. This God has a plan. He does the following. He says, I'm going to make for him a helper. And what does he do? He doesn't make the woman. He makes animals, right? So it says in verse 19, and out of the ground, same process, God forms, molds every beast of the field. That word beast is the word soul, which we would, if you take soul literally and use it all the way, thinking of soul like we think, you would have to, that is the Hebrew word for soul then. So you'd have to say every soul of the field. That's why it's a bad way to think about this. To say Adam was made a living soul, it doesn't fit. It's a once again, it's a retrojective interpretation. It means living, breathing type of character. Okay, so he makes beasts of the field, fowls of the air. Here we go. We got animals. We got birds, right? And then he brings them to Adam. This word brings means to lead them. Like in my mind, you know what I'm saying? I'm saying God walking and calling and bringing the animals. He makes them, breathes into them. I don't know how it doesn't say he breathes into them, but they became the same type of breathing, living being than what Adam became. Use your imagination. We know already how this works. Anyway, so he brings them now to Adam. And why? Because he said, I'm going to make him a companion, or I'm going to make him a helper. Here's some animals and birds and whatnot. He brings them to Adam to see what Adam would call them, and whatever Adam would call these living souls, right? That was their name. And Adam gave names to all the cattle, to the fowl of the air, to every soul of the field. But for Adam, there was not found anyone to help him. Oh, another problem. The plan didn't work. Okay. And Adam gave, and then Yahweh Elohim puts him in a deep sleep. Right now, he's going to solve the problem properly. So he puts him in a sleep. Adam falls in a deep sleep, and he takes one of his ribs. Now, the root word for rib here is the word to bend or to curve. And so that's why people call it rib, but it can also be he takes him aside. Some people even say he takes like half of Adam, takes it that side. And then it's interesting the language here. And then he made the woman. The word made is not the same word form from the clay, mold. It means literally to build or to rebuild. So this creature, this helper that is made, number one, it's going to look like Adam, and that's what the text is telling us. It takes a half of him, basically, or a rib, whichever way you want, but he takes something of Adam and he builds that up to be something. But what's also interesting here, and then he says, and closed up the flesh instead thereof. It's very vague, but the flesh here is a euphemism for the male external genitalia. And so, in my view, when I read this, it's simply he takes half of Adam out and he builds it, and she doesn't have the stuff he has. Right? Yeah, she has she doesn't have visible external genitalia like he has. Okay. So there we go. Now there's a helper. Third try lucky. First time, oh, this is not good. We need a helper for this, man. Let's make the birds and the beast and all the same type. Oh, that doesn't work. He names them, but he still doesn't have a helper. Okay, we've got a better plan. Let's split him in half, make him something that looks like him. That maybe that's going to work. And then Adam says, and here we have to make sure we know what the words mean. And then human says.
Read this 22. Made a woman and brought her to the man.
Okay. So sorry. Verse 22 of chapter 2. And the rib which the Lord God had taken from man, from Adam, he built a woman and he led her to the man. So once again, God's off building the same way that he formed the animals and leads them to Adam. He's now off building this woman. He's sleeping. When he's done, he leads this woman. He brings him back to the man. And then Adam says, so it's important that we now get our Hebrew words right here. The word there is Adam, as in human. Then human said, this is now bone of my bone and flesh of my. I like this. This is the same as me. Like this makes sense to me. Bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. And she will be called woman. Hebrew word is Isah, and that's a female person, right? Because she was taken out of. Now it doesn't use Adam anymore. It says is, which means male. Okay, so for the first time, we move away from the term human and we go to female and male. All right, so that sounds great. But then it goes on to say, and therefore the male will leave his father and mother, and he will cleave unto his wife, and they'll become one flesh. It's like the writer's explaining how marriage works and why people need to get together to procreate, and this is how it works. It works in pairs like this, all men and women. But the interesting thing is, if you go to verse 25, it says, and they were both naked, the man and his wife. It should say then Is and Isah, but it doesn't. He goes back to, and they were both naked, the Adam and his Isah, which is interesting because it means he still thinks of the man. The writer still thinks of the man as the human. Although he's male, he's still the Adam. And you can understand why this can create a lot of misogyny, because it actually creates, it paints the woman as an afterthought, number one, made after the beasts. She looks like Adam, yes, but she's a helper to him. But he's still the human. Now, unfortunately, this is the type of scriptures that were used in the church fathers. Some of the most famous church fathers are some of the most misogynistic writings you'll ever find. They quite clearly have two things against women. Number one, they are not intelligent like men, right? They weren't created to be. And number two, they are sexually promiscuous. Those are the two main things that these type of scriptures have inspired, and that's also in the Islamic religions you get the same type of problem. That's why the woman has to always cover herself. She's the problem, she took the stuff, ate it, as we'll see in a moment. But you can understand why this will produce misogynistic type of writings. The man is the human, the wife is helper on the side, afterthought type of thing.
Yeah.
Obviously, you have to keep in mind that this was written by men, right? And not modern men, patriarchal men of the 5th century, 6th century BC, where we know what life was like there. Women were there to create babies, make food, and they were not equals of men. And this story, to me, clearly shows that the man was the human, and God took something out of him, and she's a woman, she's a Isa, but he is still the human.
She's like an add-on.
She's the add-on, according to this, in my view, and not a first thought. Hey, add-on.
Yeah.
It really just feels to me like
let's start off with both.
Let's get the animals first.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, let's get the animals, and if they don't work, maybe we can do better. But it's like the last thing God creates. It's one of the things you'll notice of the story. And I'm going to say this now, which is very different from the first chapter. The woman is created last in this. That's not what's going on in Genesis 1. All right. Anyway, so that aside, they were both naked. Now, the Adam, the human, and his wife, and they were not ashamed. All right. So this is the first section, which is basically how men and women came to be, how plants, animals, birds, fish are not mentioned, but you can understand maybe they were included somehow, how they came to be. So why are there animals and women? Or let me start like this. Why is there a man? Well, somebody has to look after the earth. Okay. So why are there animals and women? Well, they are there to help the man do the job. That's kind of what you're getting from this if you read it in a very strict sense. We still don't have any rain. There's no mention of sun, moon, and stars or other divine beings. It's basically Yahweh Elohim that makes the human and then makes the add-ons. But the end goal, it seems, if you just look at this, the end goal is that the man and his helpers, they got to tend the field. They got to look after this garden. But of course, now the pawpaw is about to hit the fan. Because one of the helpers God made was a snake. It seems like the snake might have had legs, because later on he doesn't. He gets cursed and he loses his legs, and now he has to eat dust. But the snake is, number one, is cunning. Maybe that's why they called living souls in the same way that humans are called living souls. And this guy can speak. He can talk. He can talk, and he's clever. And once again, God makes him. So now you have this bad tree that gets placed in the middle of the garden. Adam doesn't eat of it. All right. Okay, the woman comes along. They don't eat of it. They carry on. So how can we get them to eat this thing? Make a snake that will delude them, right? Now you're going to be tempted to say, "Oh yeah, that old devil, the Satan." That is a Christian retrojective view of Genesis, and this doesn't say Satan. It should have, if it was. It doesn't say devil. It doesn't say that this snake was in any way divine or angelic. I really believe that it's simply the writer is writing it the way that it's supposed to be. There was a talking snake, was one of the animals that was made, and this thing was cunning. But it's all part of a grand plan. The tree, the snake, all of it is leading somewhere, right? Because really this account is trying to explain to us, why do people suffer and die? Why do people suffer and die? And so it's inferring that at some point it wasn't like this, but now it is like this. Okay, so we'll get back to that a little bit later. So the other reason why most scholars don't believe that this is actually talking about the devil or Satan is because the devil or Satan is a product of a very late Second Temple Judaism. The Torah doesn't have a devil, right? The first time we really meet something that's called the devil is really only in Job, which is a very late writing, much later than this stuff. The fact that you and me grew up Christian, we inherited Second Temple Judaism's view of the world, which is run by devils and demons, the apocalyptic view. And so Paul, our great protagonist, he he believed in this type of world, and so we inherited it. And so when we now go back and read Genesis, we force that view down on the writer of Genesis, and that's unfair to that writer. This is a talking snake that's clever, and it's going to get them to eat that tree of good and knowledge, good and evil, tree of knowledge of good and evil, which they were commanded not to eat from. Okay, so let's go to the second section now. Maybe we shouldn't. Maybe we've gone a little bit. Maybe we should do this section.
I think you should start a new section now.
Okay. So there's a second section to the first story we're dealing with, and that is now the section where the serpent comes on the scene. So we have another character. Up until now in the story, the characters of this play, if we can call it that, is Yahweh Elohim, God, right? We have the human, we have the animals and the birds created in the same way as the human, as a breathing, living animal, creature, right? Same way created. He doesn't find a mate there. He names all of them. Then God cuts him in half or takes a rib out, a piece of him, and rebuilds or builds something that looks very similar to him. And then he says, I really, really like this. And those are the only characters we really have in the story. So from here on now, we meet another character, which is a snake, a talking snake. And this snake is going to lead them into a bit of temptation. But I just want to highlight a couple of things from this first section at least. God here is absolutely hands-on.
Yes.
Right?
He's there.
If you get this, if you go watch the Odysseys, Iliad, the Iliad and Odyssey of Homer, and you'll immediately get what I'm talking about. This is written in that style. God is there, he plants things, he leads them, he takes them, he puts them, he molds them, he builds. There's a couple of other things he does later on.
So he's not invisible. Besides being there, he's not. See him if he's talking to you.
It doesn't say he's visible, but he leads them, he talks to them. It is that idea of the God
that you can see.
It does feel like that. The other thing that you might not have seen in the very early portion is it says in the day, and it only really mentions one day, and that's something you would have noticed here, that the animals, the humans, the birds, they're not made on different days. It starts off by saying in the day that the Lord God. So that's something to take a little bit of note of. Take note of the name for God, Yahweh Elohim. Let me see what are some of the other things that I can just highlight very briefly without going into too much. So it's a very terrestrially focused creation account. Things are already there. It's not ex nihilo. Things are already there. The earth is there, but it's barrenness. There's no rain, there's no plants or nothing. And so God comes like a potter, and out of the dust that's moistened by this mist, he forms this clay thing and he blows into it. As he blows into it, this thing comes alive. He takes it, he puts it in the garden, he puts trees there, and he doesn't say till it, but he says he puts him there to work that field. But now he needs a helper, and it's not good that he is alone. So technically speaking, in this account, God makes something and says it's not good. If you think about the other account, every time God makes something, he's like, yo, this is good. Yo, this is amazing. Yo, this is amazing. Until he gets to the last portion and he says, yo, this is very good. But in this account, God makes and he's like, yo, it's not good that this guy is on his own. I've got a plan. I'm going back to my pottery house and I'm making these animals that can help. Animals are helpers, you know. If you think about if someone from the 6th century is writing, a cow is a helper, etc. Makes them all these animals, leads them to him. He names all of them, but he doesn't find anybody. So the plan fails. All right, okay. So now I've got a better idea. I'm going to take his rib out. I'm going to build this human, this Issa, and now the human's going to have his helper. And he sees it and he's like, wow, that's amazing. You know, maybe in here is the writer's acknowledgement of the attraction towards the opposite sex. I like what I'm seeing. Like, this is great. I need this in my life. And he takes her, but he's still called the human, and she's called the Issa, the woman, the female. It says nothing of childbirth up until this point. But in the next section, we'll deal a little bit more with that. So that's the only thing that I want to say, is that this is very terrestrial, anthropomorphic in the very ancient sense. Like God is not somewhere else. God's not in the heavens.
Yeah.
There's no mention of heaven. He's right there, building, forming, leading, planting. He's involved with everyone. He's right. So if you've read this with us afresh, you can get that type of ancient. It feels to me very much like something like a
epic,
like a Greek epic, exactly like that, where the God is all the time there, maybe in a bit of a glistening, semi-see-through form. But he's there doing stuff, amazing stuff. But he doesn't speak and boom, far away, speak and boom. There's no mention really of his spirit anywhere doing nothing. He's there. He's holding it. It's one of the reasons why scholars say this is the oldest one of the two stories.
Okay.
Because the other one is way more advanced, way more lofty view of God. This would have been the earliest one for a couple of reasons, but one is the anthropomorphic portrayal of God as a hands-on, basically human, superpowered human that is there in the garden. In the next chapter, and the last thing I'm saying, he's walking in the garden. He's calling in the garden. Think about that. There's a specific portrayal of God in the story. All right, we're going to end here, and then next week we'll do the exile. Still part of the one story we're dealing with. But the second portion of that story is now snake comes on the scene and they get thrown out the garden. All right. Any questions or anything?
No, I find
quite
it
interesting, don't you think?
Yeah, very.
Never thought of it. Never in your whole life.
Yeah, it's very interesting.
Exactly. All right, guys. Have a wonderful Sunday, and
See you
we'll see you next week. Cheers.
Bye.